Before we begin today's video, I'd like to verbally thank my patrons, especially those donating $10 or more monthly, such as Alex Vander Wood, Almost Dead Again, Anatoly Volnov, Andrew Melnick, Big Time Jim, Colin Gajic, Cooper Sutton, Corbet Godwin, Daniel Christman, Darius Fazier, Duncan Bristow, Fralum, Jano, John Strange, JP De La Torre, JW, Missing a Tile, Mixer Rules, Money and Muses, CeeLo, Silver Silence, Vladimir's Nordholm, Wolf HD, and Young Master Pig. I will almost definitely be taking a break next week so that I can focus on two especially large projects. Those projects are an introduction to and analysis of the second season of Fargo's TV adaptation, and hopefully an analysis of Roger Waters' 1992 album Amused to Death. Thank you. It's easy to tell yourself that you've moved on from your past, but the truth is that you have no way of knowing for sure. I feel like DLC has a tough time being remembered as fondly as some of it should be. People love to talk about how good Dishonored 1 was, but rarely do you hear people talk about the fantastic Knife of Dunwall and Brigmore Witches expansions. Unless you're as high profile a game as Half-Life, it seems like DLC is just completely forgotten about, never revered as highly as the base game, which probably has a lot more to do with marketing than anything. Extra content for a game you've already played is just a tougher sell than buying a whole game. One piece of DLC whose obscurity is especially unjust is BioShock 2: Minerva's Den. BioShock 1 is exactly what I want in a game. This is a loaded statement, but in all honesty, I think it might be the most artfully designed game I've ever played, and Infinite has a lot of that same charm. But BioShock 2 always felt like a by-the-numbers sequel that plays it way too safe for a series as daring as BioShock. I won't say that it's bad or anything. For my taste, it's actually the best playing game in the series, but nothing in it inspires me to, well, create an essay like all the other content in the series has. Minerva's Den, however, that's a different story. In a lot of ways, Minerva's Den is the best piece of BioShock content out there. Spoilers ahead, I recommend you not play the remastered version of BioShock 2 or the DLC because it's very crashy. BioShock 2 and Minerva's Den have some slightly different artistic goals than the Ken Levine BioShocks. All I can do is speculate, but it seems to me that 1 and Infinite are games of multiple layers. On one level, you have an interesting narrative that deals with philosophical and ideological issues by using compelling, well-thought-out characters to showcase different viewpoints, and on another level, these games seem to host tons of meta-commentary about the nature of sequels, player characters, video game narratives, free will, and linear media. I've covered all of that stuff, but BioShock 2 and Minerva's Den, like I said, had different goals. To me, those games are simply character studies with light social commentary and not much else. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as Minerva's Den proves to me, but it's a distinction worth noting. Well, which character is Minerva's Den studying? Charles Milton Porter, an engineer who helped Alan Turing develop the first computer, the one that enabled us to crack the German Enigma code during World War II. His wife, Pearl, was killed as he was nearing the end of his work with Turing, and in his eyes, he lost her to someone else's war. So he moved to Rapture, where he could be independent of any nation, and developed the world's first AI-operated computer, the Thinker. There's a lot more of what happened to Porter, but for now, that's all we need. Here, we have a story about a man who found loneliness and turned it into a fantastic contribution to society. Turning negativity into positivity through the power of the human mind is a philosophy that I can really get behind. In fact, almost every time I go into detail about my life in one of these videos, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Last week's video was a great example of that. Channeling a negative part of your life into your work really is a fantastic way to conquer that negativity, but that doesn't make it easy by any means. In fact, for me at least, it's usually not something I intend to do in the first place. The negativity will be laying dormant somewhere in my mind, maybe for years, and eventually the subject of the video will remind me of it in a powerful way, and then it's set in stone. I have to compare whatever it is I took from the game to whatever real-life event it reminded me of. This sort of rips a band-aid off for me every time it happens, and forces me to ask questions about parts of my life that I had stopped thinking about a long time ago. It's both the most disturbing part of writing certain essays and the most creatively rewarding part. So as dark as it can get for me sometimes, it's something I try to do whenever I can. In fact, this video will be another good example of that. But back to the game itself. Porter, once he's in Rapture, rides a similar emotional roller coaster to the one I described above. After his wife died, as I said, he adopted Ryan's do-for-yourself philosophy and moved to Rapture to develop the Thinker. The Thinker would ultimately lead to a way to cure atom sickness, thus undoing so much of the damage that plasmids had done to this world. essentially meaning that Porter's loneliness would eventually cure atom sickness. He took his negativity and turned it into a driving force for an innovation, which might just be the innovation that saves Rapture in the end. However, attempting to turn negativity into positivity can be a double-edged sword. You have to deal with the negativity. I have a weekly goal that I sometimes achieve when writing these essays. I want to some small degree, expand the way I think. I want to change the way people look at things and ultimately have a positive impact on the world, however small that impact may be. That's basically always my stated goal, but sometimes it turns out that I've got an ulterior motive, unknown even to me. And what starts as a simple essay explaining my analysis of a game can quickly turn into something else. Porter, once the thinker was able to, well, think, decided to start working on personality and voice synthesis, giving the thinker the ability to mimic someone else. He first started thinking about this upon reflection on his time with Alan Turing, who, in the real world, famously created the Turing test, a means of testing if a computer is able to successfully act as a human. Well, Porter loved the idea of enabling the thinker to not only pass Turing's test, but to replicate Turing himself, an incredibly powerful statement that would be. However, as Porter says, he was really just thinking about Pearl, his late wife.
Eventually, I got around to reflecting on Alan and his intelligence test for machines. I remember grinning about the idea that I could beat it. Design a machine capable of replicating Turing himself, and wouldn't that show the old man? But then suddenly I realized I wasn't really thinking about replicating Alan at all. I was thinking about Pearl.
I've got a little theory here. I believe that, like myself, with a video such as Planescape Torment, The Nature of Man, Porter was really just trying to get Pearl back from the moment she died. After his work with Turing, he returned to London to find his wife dead, and so he made the Thinker. He thought he was just doing this as a part of his role to his world as a fantastic engineer, but in reality, everything he did after World War II was just to get him to the moment where he would hear Pearl say she loved him one last time. That's my interpretation, at least. Well, this is something I can absolutely relate to. A little under a year ago, I made this video, Damned If You Don't, analyzing Roger Waters' The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. This started out as a fun way of looking at one of my all-time favorite albums. That's all I thought it was. As I was writing, I worked in the little details explaining all the lyrics, some speculation on the intent behind musical motifs, all of that stuff, but when I looked at the bigger picture and saw my interpretation of the album fully rendered, I realized that I was writing about myself as much as I was the album. This was one of the earlier examples of the sort of analysis that I really like to do these days, talking about my life experience and the lessons I've learned using the language of other people's art as my canvas. To put it simply, this album is about a man who, at times, regrets giving up the free-spirited life of a 20-year-old in exchange for the long-term stability of marriage. I compared this to a time that I, unfortunately, cheated on someone that I loved, essentially giving in to the temptation that the album speaks of. I promise that this tangent isn't irrelevant, so stick with me. Writing this essay, it was really just a way of me trying to conquer a negative part of my past. For me, that negativity was a mistake that I had made. For Porter, that negativity is the death of his wife. But in both our cases, we originally set out to just continue doing what we were doing, and those projects turned into these reflections on our negativities. Well, for Porter, the Thinker project does eventually get him to the moment he'd been dreaming of for all of these years.
I believe I'm done feeding audio recordings and personal anecdotes to the Thinker. I am set to test the personality duplication function. Target personality, Pearl Porter. Thinker, are you ready?
Yes, Milton.
Starting test. Hello, Pearl.
Hello, Milton.
How have you been?
Just wonderful, Milton. I've missed you, though. It's been so long.
Pearl, No, this isn't right. It isn't her. Thinker, stop the test.
But what's the matter, Milton?
Oh, God.
Don't you still love me?
Oh, God, I said end function, Thinker. Now! It's over.
It wasn't what he had hoped for. The moment he heard Pearl's voice coming from the Thinker, he realized that nothing he could do would ever bring her back. Essentially, he had reached the end of bargaining, the third stage of grief, and it was time for him to move on to the fourth stage, depression. For Porter, the depression fits pretty nicely into what happened next. Now that vocal synthesis was a reality for the Thinker, Reed Wall used the Thinker to mimic Porter himself, creating an audio recording that would send Andrew Ryan's secret police after him, having him converted to a Big Daddy, wiping his memory and kickstarting the game's events. Your player character, Sigma, was CM Porter all along. Going back to the 5 stages of grief metaphor, Porter's creation, that is to say, something that just isn't Pearl, put him into this depression stage. So basically, the bulk of this game's events are, to me, a representation of what happens after bargaining, depression. This is where I was once I had made the connection between the pros and cons of hitchhiking and my greedy mistake. I had written this long, complicated essay, and all that I had really gained from it was this idea that the temptation that led me astray a few years ago was something that I was always going to feel. It was at this point in the writing process that I decided that that entire video should be a long take of me driving down the road of the girl who I cheated on. Depression at its finest, and maybe a bit of leftover bargaining. However, much like myself not knowing where the pros and cons of hitchhiking essay was ultimately going to take me, we still haven't gotten to the ending of the game. Just as one of my essays guides my mind as I write it, Porter's creation guides him through the entirety of Minerva's Den, using his own voice just to drive the metaphor further. It guides him to re-examining that moment when he realized he could never get Pearl back, that final audio log that I played earlier. Porter's depression is all about looking back on the past and mourning Pearl's death, but once he hears that final audio log, in my mind, something clicks in him, and he's able to recover the Thinker's programming and bring it to the surface. With this, and the help of Tenenbaum, he's able to save himself from being a big daddy, recover his memories, rebuild the Thinker, and finally create Tenenbaum's cure for atom sickness. Acceptance, the final stage of grief. As I was staring at my first draft of my pros and cons of hitchhiking essay, I was disappointed that I had such a sad, hopeless ending. I had spent the entire essay looking onto the past, but just like the Thinker using Porter's own voice to guide him, that first draft of my essay eventually made me realize something. I was in a pretty similar situation then as I was when I cheated on that girl. I was tempted every day to ditch the long-term stability and fulfillment of my YouTube channel to go back to my old life of partying and drugs. I was tempted to cheat on my channel. Only this time, I had just finished up some powerful reflecting on my past in the form of that first draft, and I realized that I don't need to make the same mistake again. I can deal with the day-to-day minutia of running a YouTube channel. And on that day, when I decided to get someone to play my wife in the video and put her in the pig mask, my channel's mascot, I had killed off the last of my temptation to ever get back into drugs and alcohol. I turned this negative metaphor that depressed me into a positive metaphor that reinforced the things I love about my current self. Porter, likewise, spent years of his life creating this machine, just so that when he turned it on for the first time, he would be disappointed, and his depression would worsen. However, ultimately that machine led him to accepting the bad hand he was dealt, and it went on to do nothing but fortify him and make his future world a better place. Looking back on the past can be incredibly painful. It's always going to be tempting to just be like Reed Wall and obsess instead over the future. However, if you ignore that temptation and really reflect on yourself and your past, eventually you'll have what Reed Wall never had: hope.